You walk up to someone you've met 3 times before. You've had full conversations with them. You remember what they were wearing the first time you met. You remember the story they told about their dog. You remember the way they laughed. But the moment you go to say their name, it's gone. Completely, like it was never there. And in that half second of panic, your brain starts running every trick it has. You smile wider to buy time. You point instead of addressing them directly. You engineer the whole conversation so that someone else says their name first. Sound familiar? Most people who experience this feel one of 2 things: embarrassed or broken. Like something is wrong with them. Like everyone else has some name memorizing superpower they were never given. But here's what nobody tells you. Forgetting names has almost nothing to do with memory. It has everything to do with how your brain is actually wired and what it chose to prioritize in the moment you thought you were paying attention. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why this happens, what it says about the way your mind works, and what separates people who forget names from people who don't. And I promise you, what you're about to discover is going to completely change the way you see yourself. If that sounds like something you need right now, subscribe before we go any further. This channel exists to decode the hidden systems running your mind, and there's a lot more of this coming. Let's start with the single biggest misconception about forgetting names. Most people assume it's a memory problem. They think my memory is just bad, I'm not good with names. Some people have it and some people don't. But that explanation is incomplete, and it lets you off the hook too easily while also blaming the wrong system entirely. Memory is not one thing. Your brain doesn't have a single storage unit where everything gets filed away equally. Memory is a collection of completely different systems, running parallel to each other, each specialized for a different type of information. There's your procedural memory, how to ride a bike, how to type without looking at the keys. There's your episodic memory, what happened at your cousin's wedding 3 years ago, what you had for dinner the night before your job interview. There's your semantic memory, facts, concepts, general knowledge. And then there's what researchers call verbal working memory, the system responsible for holding and encoding words and names in the short term so they can later be transferred to long-term storage. When you meet someone and they tell you their name, that name has to pass through verbal working memory before it gets stored anywhere permanent. And here's the problem. Verbal working memory has an extremely limited capacity. It can only hold a small number of items at one time. And when it gets overloaded, when too many things are competing for its attention, in that same moment, items get dropped. Not because they were never captured, but because they never made it through the processing stage before something else pushed them out. This is the first reason people forget names. The name was captured, but never truly encoded. It entered the room of your mind, but it never got a seat. And this happens not because your memory is weak, it happens because in the moment you heard that name, your brain was already doing something else that it considered more important. Hit the like button right here if you've ever smiled and nodded while someone said their name and realized a second later you have absolutely no idea what they just said. Because what you're about to hear next explains exactly why that happened. And it's not what you think. Sign 1. Your brain was processing the person. Not the name here is what's actually happening in the first few seconds of meeting someone new. Your brain is not passively receiving information like a camera recording a scene. It is actively running a threat and opportunity assessment. Within milliseconds, before you've even registered their name consciously, your brain has already started analyzing their facial expression for signs of hostility or warmth. It's reading their body language. It's comparing their appearance to people you already know. It's generating predictions about who this person is and what this interaction is going to cost or give you emotionally. This is not something you do consciously. This is your brain's social cognition system firing automatically, below the level of awareness. And it consumes an enormous amount of cognitive processing power. So much processing power, in fact, that when their name arrives usually in the first 3 seconds of the introduction, your verbal working memory is already stretched thin. The name enters, but it doesn't get the processing resources it needs to stick. It floats there for a second, unattached to anything, and then it's gone. What's fascinating about this is that it tends to affect the most socially perceptive people the most. People who are naturally attuned to reading others, who are picking up on tone, energy, micro-expressions. The subtle way someone's posture shifted when they said a certain word. These people forget names more often because their brains are doing more work in that opening moment. The name was sacrificed to something the brain considered more important, understanding the human being standing in front of them. This is not a flaw. This is a feature of how deeply your mind engages with other people. But it does mean that for people wired this way, the standard advice of just pay more attention when they say their name is almost useless. Because attention was never the problem. The distribution of attention was. Sign 2. You're living in the meaning. Not the label. Here's something that will shift the way you think about this permanently. There are 2 completely different ways the human brain can store a person. The first way is label first. You anchor the entire memory of that person to their name. The name becomes the primary tag. Everything else, what they said, how they made you feel, what they were like, gets organized around that verbal label. The second way is experience first. You anchor the memory of that person to the feeling of the interaction, to what they were like, to what they shared, to the emotional impression they left. The name, in this case, is just one piece of a much richer memory, and sometimes it's the last piece to show up when you try to retrieve the whole thing. People who never forget names tend to be label-first processors. They hear a name, they repeat it, they attach it immediately to the visual, and they've got it. People who frequently forget names tend to be experience-first processors. They absorbed everything about the person so richly, the conversation, the feeling, the energy, that the name was almost beside the point in the moment it was being stored. This is why people who forget names can often remember almost everything else about a person with startling accuracy. They remember what the person said, what they cared about, how the conversation felt. They remember the story about the dog. They remember the laugh. They just can't retrieve the 3 to 10 letters that someone's parents assigned to them at birth. Because to an experience-first brain, the name is the least interesting thing about a person. Sign 3. You have a more active default mode network. This is where the neuroscience gets genuinely fascinating. Inside your brain, there is a system of interconnected regions known as the default mode network. This network becomes active when you're not focused on a specific external task, when you're daydreaming, reflecting, imagining, or making sense of social situations. And in people who frequently forget names, research consistently shows that this network tends to be more active, even during conversations and social interactions. What this means practically is that while you are in the middle of an introduction, a part of your brain is simultaneously generating internal narratives, making associations, drawing connections between what this new person is saying and other things you know. Imagining how this relationship might unfold, or reflecting on something that was said 3 sentences ago. You are, in a very real sense, having 2 experiences at once: the external one, where you are physically present, nodding, smiling, shaking a hand, and the internal one, where your mind is already several steps ahead, processing meaning at a deeper level. The name, that single verbal label, gets caught in the crossfire. The part of your brain that needed to encode it was already busy with something else it considered more pressing. People with highly active default mode networks are typically the same people who lose track of time, who have rich inner lives, who are constantly making connections between seemingly unrelated ideas, who are described by others as thoughtful and deep, but occasionally distracted. If any of that resonates, subscribe right now, because that description is the beginning of a much larger picture of how your specific type of mind works. And this channel is dedicated to decoding exactly that picture. Sign 4. The anxiety of the introduction itself blocks encoding. There is a specific kind of social anxiety that has nothing to do with being shy or introverted. It's the anxiety of the performance of meeting someone, and it affects extroverts just as much as introverts. When you are introduced to someone new, particularly in a professional or high-stakes social context, a part of your brain starts running a parallel task, managing the impression you're making. Are you smiling the right amount? Is your handshake firm enough? Did you say something awkward? Are you making enough eye contact? Are you making too much eye contact? This impression management process requires cognitive resources. And those resources are being borrowed directly from the systems that would otherwise be encoding the name you just heard. The moment your brain went into performance mode, which happens before you consciously decide to perform the name, was already fighting for processing power it wasn't going to get. What's particularly cruel about this is that the more you care about the interaction going well, the more your brain invests in impression management, and therefore, the less capacity it has left over for encoding. The people most likely to forget names are often the people who care most about making a good impression. The social anxiety of wanting to connect properly is the very thing that prevents the connection from being encoded properly. Sign 5. Names don't come with context. Think about how easily you remember other things compared to names. You remember that your coworker loves hiking. You remember that your neighbor is going through a divorce. You remember that the barista at your regular coffee shop always writes the wrong spelling on your cup. You remember these things because they arrived with context, with story, with emotion, with some kind of meaningful hook that your brain could attach to an existing network of associations. Names are almost entirely context-free. Michael doesn't mean anything. Sarah doesn't tell your brain anything about who this person is, what they want, how to relate to them. It is a completely arbitrary label, a series of sounds that happen to correspond to a specific human being by social convention, with no inherent meaning attached. And arbitrary, context-free information is the hardest type for the human brain to store. Your brain is not a hard drive that stores everything with equal efficiency. It is an association machine. It remembers things by connecting them to other things, by weaving them into existing networks of meaning. When a piece of information arrives without any existing network to attach to, it doesn't get stored efficiently. Names, stripped of meaning and context, arrive exactly like that, floating, unattached, with nothing to grab onto, and so they slip through. This is not a bug in your memory system. This is your memory system working exactly as designed. It just happens that names, by their nature, are resistant to the way your brain prefers to encode information. Sign 6. You experience time differently during social interactions. This one is subtle, but deeply important. People who frequently forget names often report that social interactions feel shorter than they actually were. An hour-long conversation felt like 20 minutes. The introduction felt like it happened instantly. This time compression experience is directly linked to the level of cognitive engagement happening below conscious awareness. When your brain is processing at a high level, absorbing, interpreting, generating, connecting, subjective time compresses. You are so cognitively occupied that there's no surplus processing capacity left over to track time, normally, or to perform the deliberate repetition and rehearsal that memory researchers know is essential for encoding new verbal information. In practical terms, when you met that person and heard their name, you may have been processing so many things so quickly that the moment the name was spoken felt like it barely lasted at all. Not because you weren't paying attention, but because you were paying attention to so many things simultaneously that the moment didn't have room to expand and settle the way it needed to in order to leave a stable trace. People who are more present in social interactions in a surface, way less internally active, less simultaneously processing, tend to experience introductions as slower and therefore have more time, subjectively, to encode the name before the moment moves on. Sign 7. Your brain prioritizes emotional truth over factual labels. This is the deepest reason, and the one that reveals the most about how your specific mind is built. Your brain is constantly making triage decisions about what gets stored and what gets dropped. These decisions are not random. They follow a clear hierarchy. Things that carry emotional weight get encoded first and most durably. Things that are emotionally neutral, particularly if they are also context-free and arbitrary, get encoded last and least durably. When you meet someone, the emotional impression they create in you happens faster than the name does. Before their name has fully registered, you have already formed a feeling warmth or coldness, trust or caution, interest or discomfort. That feeling gets encoded immediately, automatically, durably. The name, which arrives slightly later and carries no emotional charge on its own, has to compete for encoding resources that the emotional system already claimed. People who forget names are, neurologically speaking, emotional processors first. Their memory is organized by how things felt, not what they were called. This is why they can walk back into a room and immediately remember how they felt the last time they were there. Or why they can remember a conversation from 10 years ago in vivid emotional detail while having no idea what the other person's name was. This is not a weakness. This is a different, and in many contexts, more sophisticated way of organizing experience. The world needs people who remember how you made them feel. It just so happens that those same people are the ones who show up at their friend's wedding and quietly panic because they cannot remember the name of the best man they met at the rehearsal dinner the night before. If this is hitting close to home, drop your number in the comments below. If this sounds exactly like you, drop a 1. If you recognize this in someone close to you, drop a 2. And if you've been quietly embarrassed about forgetting names your whole life, and this is the first time you've heard an explanation that actually makes sense, drop a 3. I read every single comment, and I want to know where you land. What you can actually do about it now that you understand the mechanism. Let's talk about what actually helps, not the generic advice you've already heard, but the approaches that work specifically for the type of mind we've been describing. First, encode the name with an emotion, not just a repetition. The standard advice is to repeat the name back immediately. Nice to meet you, Michael. This helps somewhat, but it works better if you simultaneously attach an emotional association. Don't just repeat the name. As you repeat it, look for something about this person that genuinely interests you, and link the name to that. Michael has that energy like someone who's been through something difficult and came out sharper. That emotional hook gives the name something to attach to in your memory network. Second, give yourself permission to ask again. The anxiety of not knowing a name, the performance of pretending you remember, consumes far more cognitive energy than simply saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name the first time." Almost everyone finds this charming rather than offensive. And the act of hearing the name again, this time without the initial overload of first impression processing, gives you a second opportunity to encode it properly. Third, create a visual anchor. For experienced first processors, the most effective encoding strategy is visual rather than verbal. When you hear a name, immediately construct a vivid mental image that connects the name to the person's face or a dominant feature. The more bizarre or emotionally charged the image, the better. This converts the arbitrary verbal label into something your brain can attach to a richer, more multi-sensory memory trace. Fourth, reduce impression management. This is the hardest one, but the most powerful. The more you can let go of monitoring how you're coming across in the first moments of meeting someone, the more cognitive capacity becomes available for actual encoding. The best way to reduce impression management is to shift your focus entirely onto genuine curiosity about the other person. When your brain is genuinely interested in learning about someone, it naturally reallocates resources away from performance monitoring and toward intake and processing. Ironically, people also find you more impressive when you're genuinely curious about them than when you're visibly managing your own impression. Fifth, accept the architecture. The deepest and most freeing thing you can do is understand that this pattern in your memory is not separate from the things you value about your mind. It is the same architecture. The depth of your processing, the richness of your inner life, the sensitivity to emotional experience, these are not separate from your tendency to forget names. They are the same system. You cannot fully have one without the other. Accepting the trade-off doesn't mean giving up on improving it, means stopping the self-criticism that has been draining energy you could be using for something else. The bigger picture, what we've been talking about today, is not really about names. Names are just the surface. What we've actually been talking about is a specific type of mind, one that processes experience deeply and emotionally, that is highly attuned to the internal world, that runs rich and active inner narratives even in the middle of external interactions, and that organizes memory around meaning and feeling rather than labels and facts. This type of mind forgets names more easily. It also tends to understand people more deeply. It tends to feel things more intensely. It tends to make connections that other minds miss. It tends to remember, years later, exactly how a conversation felt, even if it can't remember the name of the person it was with. These things are not coincidences. They are expressions of the same underlying architecture. And once you understand the architecture, you stop experiencing it as a defect and start experiencing it as what it actually is. A particular way of being in the world, with particular strengths and particular costs, like every other way of being human. The goal is not to fix yourself. The goal is to understand yourself well enough to work with the system you have, to compensate where compensation is useful, and to stop apologizing for the things that were never actually problems to begin with. If this video helped you see yourself a little more clearly today, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it tells me that this kind of content is reaching the people who need it. And before you close this, subscribe, because next week we're going deeper into the architecture of minds like this one, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Until then, you are not broken. You just process differently. And that difference, once understood, is one of the most powerful things about you.